heard Vince Cerf earlier today suggest that I was not a connoisseur of wine. And what he doesn't realize is a secret to life is to have friends who have boats, friends who have cars and planes, and friends who think they're really good at selecting wine because they pay for it in the end. And we had a bottle of wine last night. It was fantastic, and he paid for it. Anyway, I have 35 minutes remaining, and I already talked too fast. I'm from New York, and I apologize for that. I'll try to slow down. But the other thing is I'm basically annoying. So I'm going to give an annoying talk, and I'd like to apologize in advance because I mean well. But some of you will be annoyed by some of the things I'm going to say. And this is what I'm going to talk about is invite you to do some applied history. One of the big problems facing the world, I'm sure you'll agree, is energy, solving energy. And being an internet person, I think the way to solve energy is to do the same things we did in the building of the internet. So I'm inviting you to help me collect lessons from the history of the internet and applying them to solving energy. I got into the energy business thanks to the MIT president, Susan Hockfield, who in her 8 years as president managed to get a full 250, a quarter of the MIT faculty working on energy, which I think was an amazing accomplishment. I, on the other hand, was a venture capitalist during this period. So the way I worked on energy was to invest in companies. And this is an inventory of the energy technology, Enertech companies that I managed to work on during this period. The red ones went bankrupt. The yellow ones I'm still on the board of, and the green ones got bought by other companies. So that was how I participated in this energy, in solving energy. But I'm an internet guy and an old one. I'm not quite as old as Vince Cerf. He's a much older man than I am. I have a few years to go before I turn 70. But when I was on the internet, and this is a picture of it, you see those dots on the screen? Those are not cities. Those dots are computers. That's how many computers there were on the internet in 1974. And so the question is, how does somebody who comes from that background have anything to say about energy? And so the energy people are very annoyed by an internet person having opinions about energy. And my answer to them is, look, you've had energy for decades and you haven't really done very much with it. So please get out of the way and let the internet people come now and solve energy for you. So this analogy, I begin by making this analogy between energy and information, between power and between bandwidth. This is an old analogy. Others have made it. So I am trying to make this analogy so that we can learn from the successful history of the internet in solving energy. We used the internet to build the internet. That was one of the secrets. Use the internet to build the internet, so let's use the internet to solve energy. So Enernet is a collection of lessons from the history of the internet which we're applying to solving energy. And by solving energy, I mean by providing a squanderable abundance of cheap and clean energy. The internet brought us a squanderable abundance of cheap and clean bandwidth. Now we need cheap and clean energy. And this is history. So you've heard the expression, those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. Have you heard that? This is the guy who said that. And actually, that's not what he said. He said those who do not study the past are doomed to repeat it. What he said about history is that history is a bunch of lies told by people about events that never happened by people who weren't there. And my only saving grace is in the building of the internet, I was there. I may not be as old as Vince Cerf, but I'm close. And by the way, while typing into Google Santillana, I found Carlos Santana, which is, and he also said something wise about energy, which is you've got to change your evil ways, baby. So now when you're doing history, you need to name the era. So the internet era, when did it begin? And you'll get many opinions on when the internet era began. This year, 2013, we celebrated last May the Ethernet's 40th birthday. So the internet is way before that. Many young people believe the internet started with the founding of Google in 1998. There was the ARPANET, which began functioning in 1969. That may be the beginning of the internet. Or it may go back even further to, let's say, all the way back to the invention of the transistor. And the reason I like that definition of the internet era is that makes the internet and me exactly the same age, both born in 1946. Now, one of the consequences of something taking decades, so solving the internet took decades, especially if you go all the way back to 1946, energy is going to take decades to solve, and that means one of the dangers is hardening of the categories. So in the early days of the internet, and my two favorite examples of hardening of the categories, in the early days of the internet, in fact, Vint Cerf himself went to Washington and held hearings whose purpose was to define the difference between computing and communication. And he needed to do that because AT&T was in the United States, AT&T was in charge of communication, and the Federal Communications Commission regulated AT&T, whereas computing was done by IBM, which was at the time being regulated by the Justice Department. So they needed hearings to decide what was computing and what was communication. And right after those hearings were done, the internet came along and erased the distinction. That is, the internet is computing and communication inextricably linked, and there's no way of dividing computing and communication. A more persistent version of this hardening of the categories is voice, video, and data. Voice used to be telephone, video used to be television, data was the teletype. And that distinction, there were separate industries, separate terminologies, voice, video, and data, and those categories took a very long time to go away. So we should look for the same problem in energy. That is a false categorization. And here's the first example. This is corn ethanol, which is very popular in the United States. A terrible mistake. And it is a mistake of categories, because the people who made these laws encouraging corn ethanol, they chose the wrong feedstock and the wrong fuel. But they failed to notice that feed for animals and food for people and fuel for cars are not separate categories. That is, if you try to interfere with the price of corn for purposes of energy, you're also interfering with the price of corn as a food. And so we've run right into a problem where we're disturbing the price of food inadvertently by trying to influence the price of energy, a categorical mistake. Another thing that the internet was a movement. You know what a movement is? It's sort of an emotional thing. It has gods and dogma and clergy and slogans. You know the internet as a movement? And you saw the grand priest of the internet here a few minutes ago on the stage. Another thing that movements have is colors. Like in the bottom is a picture of the early Ethernet. Ethernet's color. Ethernet was a movement in its day, early days, and its color was yellow. The cable was yellow. So people in the Ethernet movement used to wear yellow t-shirts. Okay, now let's look at energy. When you talk about energy, is there a particular color that comes to mind? Green. We're going to get to blue. But red, no. Well, green is currently I would say, is the color of energy. And I've been, for 4 years, I've been trying to convince people that green is really a bad choice for energy. Because the people called the Greens, they're pro-environmentalism, that's okay, but they're also against all the tools that we need to solve energy. They're against capitalism, they're against America, they're against nuclear, they're against hydro. Green is a really bad choice for energy. So I've been trying to promote a different color for energy, and I started with black, because black isn't a color. But oil's black and coal is black. By the way, silicon is not black. Did you know that? The little chips are black, but the silicon is more like a mirror. So black was not a good choice. So then I looked at the absorption spectra of photosynthesis and noticed that plants absorb blue and red. Even plants don't like green. So then what color should we choose, red or blue? And the obvious answer is blue. This is a picture of Earth from space. It is blue. So let's leave green for the environmentalists, but let's have a new color for energy and let's call it blue. And I've been promoting this idea of using blue as energy's color for now 3 or 4 years, and I can assure you that it's not catching on. So speaking of colors, here's a lot of black. Have you all seen this picture? This has several pictures stitched together. It's a picture of Earth at night. And usually this picture is shown to Americans to make them feel bad about all the energy that we consume. And the suggestion is that we need to conserve energy and, in fact, darken the Earth. Our goal should be to darken the Earth. I don't think so. I think our goal should be to brighten the Earth, make the entire Earth look like North America and Europe and Japan. And it comes from the impulse to conserve. When the internet was first coming alive, what we did was to conserve bandwidth. We invented data compression. We invented shared media. Ethernet, for example, is shares a cable. It shares to conserve bandwidth. So now we built the internet, and after all that conservation, do we now on the internet, do we use less bandwidth than we did before we built the internet? Like half? Are we down to half now? How about we're using 1 million times more bandwidth than before? So if the internet is any guide, the conservation mindset is the wrong one. Because when we're done solving this problem, this is the annoying part of my talk, by the way. So when we're done solving energy, we will not be using less of it. We will be using more. The mindset should be closer to that of the internet. We are moving toward, and it will take decades, a squanderable abundance of energy. Now, does this mean that I'm against conservation? No. This is a picture of my car, actually. That woman is not my wife. My wife is better looking than that. So I'm not against conservation. I went from a 12-cylinder Mercedes to a 3-cylinder Mercedes in the interest of conservation of energy, and still that car gets only 38 miles per gallon. It should get 100. And then there's the whole notion of conserving energy by using the internet to carry your bits around. So why are we all in this? Why am I in this room? Shouldn't I be talking to you on that screen from Maine, where I'm spending the summer, instead of flying, burning all that fuel to get here? Why didn't I transport my bits instead of my atoms? So anyway, conservation is not a bad thing. I'm just suggesting conservation, if the internet is any guide, conservation is not the right mindset for solving energy, because eventually we'll have an abundance of it. Another lesson of the internet has been surprises. There have been many surprises. For example, when we set out to build the internet, the dominant form of computing was punch cards with batch processing mainframes. And then very quickly, as the internet began to spread, the platform changed over to interactive time-sharing systems. And then as we entered the 80s, the platform changed again to networks of personal computers. And now, of course, as indicated in the lower left, we're now on to the mobile cell phone version of the internet. So these were all surprises. In designing the internet, at the very beginning, we weren't anticipating these surprises, the rapid evolution of what we were going to be networking. Another surprise, particularly embarrassing to me, is in the early days of the internet, if you had a packet, that's a packet switch you're seeing, Vince showed this too. We had a packet switch at MIT, and there were 4 computers connected to it. And our sponsor, ARPA, asked us how the traffic was going, and most of the traffic in our switch was never leaving the building. It would go in the packet switch and go to the other machines on the same floor. And we were embarrassed about that. It was referred to as incestuous traffic within the building, and it was embarrassing. And only a few years later, Ethernet got invented, and then all the traffic was incestuous. And that was a big surprise, and a big inversion of our model. Here's an even bigger surprise. In the early days of the internet, we thought that for local distribution, we were going to use the coaxial cable that had been, the copper cable that had been put in for 100 years by the telephone companies. We thought we were going to use that for local distribution, and that for long haul, we were going to use microwave and satellite. Is that the way the internet works today? No, it's completely flipped. Now we use optical fibers for long haul, and for short haul we use wireless. It completely surprised us, and this is called the Negroponte switch, one of the huge surprises of the internet. And then there are these annoying surprises of the internet, basically bugs. We didn't make the internet secure enough, the quality of service was too low, and we forgot to put economics in. And we've been spending the last 20 or 30 years re-engineering the internet to have security, to have quality of service, and to have some economic models. Then there's the big surprise of the internet bubble. That is a plot of stock prices, and that big blip there is the internet bubble around 1999, and then the bubble burst, surprise. And the thing about that surprise was the internet during that whole period was just doubling every year, except there was this bubble that occurred that caused a lot of investments that didn't turn out. So there were many bubbles in the internet, and if the internet is any guide, there will be many bubbles in energy, and we've already had a few. Global warming was a bubble. It burst. A couple of years, this is Al Gore, during the height of the global warming bubble. The global warming bubble has burst. Does that mean the Earth is suddenly getting cold? No. The Earth is getting warmer. It's just that we had a speculative bubble that led to a lot of foolish investments in energy companies a few years ago, from which we're still recovering. That is, the investment in energy startups is now depressed because of all the bad feelings left over from the bursting of the global warming bubble. Now, bubbles are a good thing. There's this impulse we all have, and whenever we suffer a bubble, we want to run to the government to make bubbles illegal. And that's probably not the right response. That is, in studying bubbles, I've concluded that they are a tool of innovation and we should enjoy our bubbles. Now, the trick is not to be one of the losers in the bubble, but the bubbles themselves help accelerate innovation, as it certainly occurred in the many bubbles of the internet, and the same is occurring in energy. Another thing we had in the internet was laws. We had a very famous law that sort of explained everything that happened. Does anyone care to guess what it was called? Give you a hint, it begins with M. Well, actually, not Metcalfe's law. The one I was talking about is called Moore's law, which is the important one. The Moore's law and Metcalfe's law, what they have in common is they begin with M. But we had laws. This is my law. Moore's law is the more important one. And these are sort of agenda-setting prediction machines of the movement. So energy needs some of those, and I found one, Sachs' law. Ellie Sachs, MIT professor, has been plotting progress on the cost of solar energy for a very long time. And you can see it's sort of a straight line on a semi-log. This happens to be a volume shipped versus cost. That line has been steady for a very long time, and this predicts that very soon, by 2020, solar energy will be cheaper even than coal, which is the goal of Professor Sachs's company. It's just that it's not happening overnight. It's happening according to a law, much like Moore's law. And we need some more laws of this type in energy. And speaking of laws, then there's government, Washington, D.C. And one of the lessons of the internet has been that Washington, D.C. is a pro-am. I don't know if you know what a pro-am is, but I can assure you that when innovators go to Washington, we are the AMs. And the people in Washington, or I guess Paris, are the pros. And you have to be careful when you go to the government looking for stuff, the internet teaches us, because sometimes you get the wrong stuff. Jumping to energy, in the 70s, the United States government created a Department of Energy whose purpose was to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. The budget of the Department of Energy has grown steadily for 30 years. It's now way in excess of $25 billion a year. Our dependence on foreign oil is much higher than it was in 1974. The only thing the Department of Energy seems to have accomplished is no new nuclear power plants have been built in the United States for 30 years, thanks to the Department of Energy. So that didn't really work out well, I think. So we need to be careful. I think the lesson here is we need to be careful when we go to government to solve important things like the internet or like energy. I'm happy to report nuclear seems to be coming back. This is a picture of the inside of a nuclear power plant. What color is that? Blue. Have I mentioned blue earlier in my talk? Blue keeps coming up. Now, DC, in this case, the federal government, did actually help the internet, and it would be foolish to ignore that. The first thing the government did was to demonopolize. As I mentioned earlier, we had in the US, two big monopolies. We had IBM doing most of computing, and we had AT&T doing most of communications. Thanks to the US government, both those monopolies were broken, which created the opportunity for us to build the internet. The government was also a standards maker. It helped in the construction of standards, and those standards, TCP/IP, came out of the Department of Defense. That was a standard that, of course, led to, as you heard from Vint earlier, the proliferation of the internet. The government also served as a lead customer. It's about 10 to 20 or 30% of our economy, and when it decides to buy packet switches from Cisco, that jump-starts Cisco. And when it in other words, as a lead customer, the government was very important. But aside from these three things, the government did another very important thing in the development of the internet, and so we should expect that in the development of energy, which is research. So the government supported research, which led inexorably to the building of the internet. We should expect a similar phenomenon in energy research. And as I mentioned earlier, since it's going to take us decades to solve energy, there's time for science. That is, we don't have the technologies yet that we need to solve energy, and we need to pursue them through government-sponsored research. One of my favorite places for governments to sponsor research, of course, is the University of Texas. But more generally, research universities. And the United States has 100 of them. And if the internet is any guide, energy will be solved by science coming out of research universities, because that's what happened in the internet. Now, here's the energy system, very complicated. And the way the internet solved the complexity of telecommunications was with an architecture. So in the early days of the internet, people like Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn and John Postel developed an architecture for the internet. Have you all heard of the seven-layer model of telecommunications? That model was probably the best decision ever made in the building of the internet, because it allowed 7 groups of people and 7 sets of technologies to evolve at their own pace separately, and then interface together in this 7-level model. And it also created a very important thing, serendipity. That is, through the construction of this architecture, each layer allowed for serendipity, that is, the discovery of unexpected things on the layers above it. And I'll elaborate on that. Another thing that happened in the internet is it moved from centralized. In the upper left there, you see the centralized mainframe all the way down to the microprocessor. So if the internet is any guide in solving energy, we're going to go from centralized to distributed. And the network itself will change. Now we think of the power network as principally distributing energy from a central point, these big mainframe energy producers. It would seem that if the internet is any guide, we're going to move to a more highly connected, symmetric network for the exchange of energy, for moving energy around from randomized sources to randomized sinks in much the same way as we do in the internet. Perhaps we'll even call it power packet switching through a meshed and symmetric network. In building the internet, we desynchronized it. It used to be clicking on a global clock. And then what we did to build the internet is stop that. There is no global clock in the internet. Packets on the Ethernet, for example, contain their own clock. Every packet has its own clock. Well, energy is highly synchronized today. In fact, there's a separate part of the energy industry whose purpose is matching the frequency and phase of power when you put it onto the network. And that suggests a level of fragility that we must do away with and desynchronize power. And then there's local area networks. The internet wasn't finished until we had invaded the building. It wasn't enough to deliver the internet to the building. We had to get it into the building, and that goes for the smart grid. That is, we can't just have a smart grid that ends at the building. It must go, if the internet is any guide, it must go inside the building. So we can expect to have smart grid LANs. And then a huge difference in the building of the internet was the addition of the addition of storage. The original internet, or rather the telecommunications network that the internet started with, had no storage. That is, it was the goal of that AT&T network to get the bits through it in 150 milliseconds without any delay. And in the course of building the internet, of course, we've added huge amounts of storage of great variety, including the storage on your cell phone, the storage in the routers, the storage in the servers. So therefore, in solving energy, we can expect storage to play a role. So a very high priority in the science of energy now is developing energy storage so that we can moderate between the randomness of supply and the randomness of demand. And then there's the control plane for energy. In the internet, we devised the notion of separate control and switching planes. You control the network at one level and you're carrying all the traffic at the other. A similar model is likely to be useful in the solution of energy. Okay, so let's say, this is more fun now. Let's say we're successful in delivering squanderable abundance of energy. What will we use it for? And the way I name this is YouTube. When Vint and others and I were working on the early internet, we were not planning to do YouTube. The idea of uploading videos from your cell phone to share with your friends was not on our mind. And yet YouTube is now most of the traffic on the internet, or various forms of video. So that suggests a similar question for energy. What will be the YouTubes of energy? That is, when we produce squanderable amounts of energy, what will we use it for? And that's a game I like to play. Since energy is a factor of production in our economies, having cheap and clean energy will just boost the economy, just automatically. In fact, we've performed the reverse experiment. We've tried making energy expensive, $140 per barrel, and immediately our economies went into recession. Well, the reverse is true. As we have cheap and clean energy, we can expect economic growth to return robustly. But more specifically, how about space travel? It turns out if we go out 70 years and we say that 5% of the population will either go to the moon and back or migrate to Mars, how much energy would that take? It turns out it would take about 500 exajoules per year, which is approximately how much energy the human race uses today. So that'll be an important possible use of this squanderable amounts of energy, namely space travel. And in a time frame of 70 years, that's not out of the question. That is, we're already getting into commercial space travel. So this is a potential use of squanderable amounts of energy. Then there's all the personalized medicine, scanning and genetic sequencing. It turns out this does not take much energy, wouldn't put a real dent in squanderable abundance of energy. But then there's solving water. You know, we have millions of people die every year. I think it's 1 million actually die every year from bad water. Why don't we solve that problem? I did a calculation on the back of an envelope. If we boiled all the water on Earth and provided everybody with 400 liters per day, that would take 7.6 times the amount of energy that we currently use today. Of course, we're not going to boil it. We'll do something smarter. And then there's the ultimate use of squanderable amounts of energy, which is to solve global warming. So this professor has a device, which you see pictured here, which if you give it enough energy, it will take the CO2 out of the atmosphere and bury it. So that's another potential use of energy, a very large amount of energy. So those are, and it's kind of fun to think about adding to this list. What would we do if we had squanderably abundant energy? And I've just listed a few of them. Now, how did this solution to the internet get built? Now, this is ThreeCom Corporation. There's me on the left, the inventor, and there's Bill at the top. He was the recruited him from HP to help run our company, and there's Dick at the lower, Dick Kramluck in the lower right. He was our big investor. Here's another. This is Cisco. Those are the two inventors in the upper left, Sandy and Len. There's the wizened, old, experienced CEO, John Morgridge, and there's the hotshot investor, lower right, Don Valentine, created Cisco Systems. This is Akamai out of Boston, the professor at the top left, the two graduate students who founded the company, and then my venture capital partner, George Conrades, who went in to run that company. There's Google, professors on the left, entrepreneur students in the middle, and then the venture capitalists and the senior managers. I submit that the internet was built by startups out of research universities, and I've just given you a few examples. And the model for that was developed by a French guy whose name was George Doria, who 67 years ago invented modern venture capital, I've called this the Doria Ecology. So I'm suggesting the major lesson coming from the internet is that we're going to solve energy with startups coming out of this, various versions of this Doria Ecology, where we have research funding from the government, we have research professors conducting the research, we have their students. Just think of the students as vehicles for carrying that research into the market. We have scaling entrepreneurs to help them build their companies. We have venture capitalists who often will be involved in financing them. We have strategic partners, which would be large companies partnering with the startups. And then, God bless them, the early adopters. These are customers willing to buy products from startups. We have a lot of those in the US. Do you have any of those in France? No? You should work on that. Early adopters are a key to keeping the innovation system going because they'll actually buy the products of startups. So that is a very short summary of the lessons, my view of the lessons of the internet and how those might apply to solving energy. And I do have 5 minutes left, so let me thank you and open it up to questions.